U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes an unannounced visit to Iraq for talks on the future of Syria. Egypt and the League of Arab States condemn Israel's incursion into the buffer zone with Syria. And the death toll from Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip rises to over 44,000 and more than 106,000 wounded. Good evening, you're now watching Qnews, and we begin today's bulletin with the latest developments in Syria. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has made an unannounced visit to Iraq for talks on the future of neighboring Syria. Blinken visited the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and said he spoke to Sudani about the situation in Syria. Blinken is touring the region in the wake of the swift collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government in the face of an advance by Syrian opposition factions.
It does so in a way that, of course, protects all of the minorities in Syria, that produces an inclusive...
The Red Cross has announced the opening of 2 new telephone hotlines aimed at reuniting Syrians who have been missing for years with their families. However, the Red Cross warned that many cases could take months or even years to resolve. Spokesperson for Chairperson Jennifer Fenton, the UN Special Envoy for Syria, stated that numerous challenges remain in stabilizing Syria. She also mentioned that Pedersen planned to travel to Jordan and meet with Arab foreign ministers over the weekend. Egypt and the League of Arab States have condemned Israel's incursion into the buffer zone with Syria. At Egypt's initiative, the League of Arab States convened on December 12th to address Israel's occupation of additional Syrian territory in the Golan Heights. The resolution condemned Israel's incursions into the buffer zone and other areas, reaffirming the Golan Heights as Syrian land. It called on the international community to enforce Security Council Resolution 497, which demands Israel's withdrawal, and urged the Arab group in New York to push for a Security Council session to address Israel's action. Egyptian Foreign Minister Badr Abdulati and his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi have agreed that both nations should promote peace and negotiations to achieve stability in the Middle East. The two sides discussed regional and international issues with a focus on the Palestinian conflict. They also addressed Syria, where Egypt rejected Israeli violations of Syrian sovereignty. Both ministers emphasized the importance of strengthening cooperation, upholding the UN Charter, and reforming global institutions to better represent developing countries.
包容性的政治进程，防止恐怖和极端势力趁机。
President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has stated that the Commission increased its humanitarian funding to more than 160 million euros. The European Commission has launched a humanitarian air bridge for Syria, delivering 50 tons of health supplies from Dubai to Adana, Turkey, and 46 tons of health, education and shelter items from Denmark to UNICEF and the WHO. An additional 4 million euros has been mobilized, bringing total humanitarian support to 163 million euros in 2024. UN spokesperson Stefan Djuric has said United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres is deeply concerned about the recent and extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Djuric told reporters that the Secretary General is particularly concerned about the hundreds of Israeli airstrikes on multiple locations in Syria, stressing the urgent need to de-escalate violence on all fronts across the country.
And calls on the parties to the agreement to uphold their obligations under this instrument, including by ending all unauthorized.
Israel has ordered troops to prepare to stay on Mount Hermon throughout the winter within a buffer zone that has existed for decades along the border with Syria. Israel has stated that its deployment to the buffer zone is temporary, but concerns have grown over what United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres described on Thursday as extensive violations of Syria's sovereignty and territorial integrity, urging Israeli forces to withdraw from the buffer zone. And for more analysis, we now move to Mark in our newsroom. To you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Moina. Now, for more on the current situation in Syria, we are joined from Cairo by an expert at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies, Dr. Mohammed Ez Al-Arab. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News. So what do we expect as a result from Jordan's Syria summit?
An attempt from the side of a number of Arab states, key Arab states like Egypt, Emirates, Qatar, Jordan, Iraq, as well as other Western countries. They are all working to secure a safe and peaceful transition of power in Syria for a number of considerations. The first one is the importance of the stability of the situation in Syria because it is bound to the regional stability as a whole. When there is a conflict or when there is a confrontation if there is a crisis, the impact will not be only limited to the inside of Syria, but it will be ramifying to other areas and other regions and other states around Syria, whether directly or indirectly. And this would be in the same context that we have seen over the last 1.5 decades of the era of Bashar al-Assad, or like what happened in other Arab countries and other regional places like in Iraq after the occupation in 2003 and Afghanistan after being invaded in 2001. The other consideration is that the vacuum of power or the non-state situation or the non-regime situation would be urging some terrorist organizations and extremist groups to fill such vacuum. And this is basically the thing that nobody among the people who would meet in Amman tomorrow would be accepting. They will be working not to allow the expansion of any of these organizations or groups into some areas inside Syria. Therefore, there is a fear of their spread to other areas in Syria or outside Syria. The third consideration is that the Middle East region is full of conflicts and crises. And here we could be speaking about the repercussions of instability inside Syria. And this will be adding to the cost of instability in the Middle East, especially that there are many other dimensions that pertain to these societies, like the humanitarian situation, the livelihood problems. So the upcoming period might witness some crises, some humanitarian crises facing the Syrian citizens in different areas of Syria. Therefore, the meeting in Amman, Jordan, will be discussing how to limit the humanitarian crises that might be facing the citizens in Syria.
And Doctor, what does Israel, why does Israel describe or consider the occupied Golan Heights as, and I quote, vital land for Israelis?
First, Israel is trying, it's trying to take the opportunity of what is happening and to make use of the situation to start new fronts of confrontation in a way that leads to a military escalation to destabilize Syria. They do that for many considerations, the first of which is that Israel, under Benjamin Netanyahu, is moving towards more expansion and more occupation of Arab territories in different places. This has happened in Lebanon, and this has happened before in Gaza, and more expansion in the West Bank. So with the fall of the regime of Assad, this is a golden opportunity for more expansion of Israel in Qnews, in Jabal al-Sheikh area, and this Israeli expansion is bound with the conduct of the current government in Israel that wants to be more expanding and more engulfing Arab territories. There is also another consideration, which is that Israel wants to create some new situation on the ground against the regime that is still under making. It wants to build a new status quo against the yet to be formed situation in Syria, because Syria is now in a political vacuum and it is transitioning into a new regime. So Israel wants in this context to create some new fact by occupying and taking certain areas in Golan and around Golan, so as it would not be returning Golan anymore to Syria. So Golan becomes fully Israeli and not Syrian anymore. The utmost thing that Israel can do is to release some other parts that it has already controlled, to send a message to the Syrians that in case the Syrians would demand once again the Golan Heights, this would be a confrontation for the Syrian new regime. The same way that Israel has been abusing the territories of the former Syrian regime. There is a third consideration. Israel wants to limit any kind of threat that could come from the Syrian front, because Israel considers Syria as one of the areas of influence of Iran in the Middle East, one of the axes of resistance supported by Iran, and Shiite militias were coming from Iraq and from Iran, and they consider Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen as parts of these axes that are attached to Iran. So Israel believes that ending the Iranian influence in Syria is a priority for Israel. Israel wants this to be controlled, and this is a systematic plan by Israel to ignite the front with Syria and to have a military escalation with the new Syrian regime in order not to allow any threat from Syria to Israel.
Okay, and of course, Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, has had talks on Syria in an unplanned trip to Iraq. What might you think the key points that were discussed were?
Blinken belongs to the Biden administration, and Blinken is working to discuss things about the new Syria in Iraq. He met with the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mohammed Shia al-Sudani, and the American administration is trying through this kind of contact to revive the opposition against Assad, to build a comprehensive government that would limit the influence of the Islamic groups. But it's apparent that Blinken and the Prime Minister of Iraq, Sudani, discussed a number of issues, including the conviction among a number of states that Syria, while transitioning from the Assad regime to another regime, should be protecting the minorities and forming a government that is not sectarianist. And also, he might have discussed how to cooperate with Iraq so Syria would not be a base for terrorism or affect the rest of the countries of the region.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us from Cairo. That was expert at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies, Dr. Mohammed Az Al-Arab. Thank you very much for your insights, and it's back to you, Mona.
Thank you so much, Mark, for the analysis, and back to our bulletin, where U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has stated that partners in the region agreed on the need for a unified approach to advance many shared interests. On Thursday, Blinken met with Jordan's King Abdullah II and Foreign Minister Ayman Safadi as President Joe Biden's outgoing administration advocates for an inclusive transition in Syria following the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad.
To advance many of our shared interests. And so here on the ground in the region, we're working to build up.
Leaders of the G7 are scheduled to meet in an effort to forge a unified approach to Syria's new government. The G7 meeting virtually expressed readiness to support Syria's transition to an inclusive and non-sectarian government. They called for the protection of human rights, including those of women and minorities, and emphasized holding the Assad regime accountable for its crimes, while pledging support for a Syrian government that upholds these principles. Deputy Executive Director of the UN World Food Programme, Carl Sakau, has warned that Syria is facing the aftermath of a civil war, a rise in refugees from Lebanon, and the sudden removal of al-Assad. Sakau stated that even before the current crisis, more than 3 million people in Syria faced acute food shortage, but the WFP could only assist two-thirds due to funding cuts. While Aleppo remains calm and orderly, Sakau highlighted ongoing uncertainty in Damascus, including disrupted markets, falling currency value, rising food prices, and inoperable transportation. And moving on to Gaza, at least 35 Palestinians, including several children, have been killed in an Israeli airstrike on houses in the Nusayrat camp in central Gaza. Medics said these strikes hit a postal facility in Nusayrat camp where displaced families had sought refuge and also damaged several nearby houses. Earlier on Thursday, 2 Israeli airstrikes in southern Gaza killed 13 Palestinians, whom Gaza medics and Hamas identified as part of a force protecting humanitarian aid trucks. Gaza-based health authorities have announced that the death toll from Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip has risen to over 44,875, with more than 106,454 wounded. A Palestinian man has been injured by live ammunition during Israeli military raid on the city of Nablus in the northern occupied West Bank. Israeli occupation forces also stormed the eastern part of the city, including areas around the Balata and Askar refugee camps. Clashes broke out between the occupation military and local residents, during which soldiers fired live ammunition, sound bombs, and toxic tear gas. U.S. National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan has said that he believes a deal on Gaza ceasefire and detainees release may be near. Sullivan said he planned to travel to Qatar and Egypt, Washington's partners in moderating the talks to advance efforts aimed at bringing detainees home. He added that these efforts would also facilitate a massive increase in humanitarian assistance.
To ensure the final impetus is there to bring this all together. We've been close before and haven't gotten there, so I can't make...
Palestine's health ministry has warned that patients could die due to a lack of food and water. Palestinian health authorities have warned that dozens of wounded patients at the Indonesian hospital are at risk of dying due to a lack of food and water. The Ministry of Health in Gaza stated late on Tuesday that 60 patients were at risk of death. And in global news, President Emmanuel Macron has appointed veteran François Bayrou as France's new Prime Minister. Bayrou replaces Michel Barnier, who resigned last week after far-right and leftist lawmakers voted to topple the government, plunging France into its second major political crisis in 6 months. A second impeachment motion against President Yoon Suk-yeol has been officially submitted to South Korea's parliament. Yoon survived the first impeachment attempt last Saturday when most members of his ruling People Power Party, the PPP, boycotted the vote. Since then, at least 7 PPP members have publicly expressed support for a vote to impeach him. Opposition parties, which control the single-chamber parliament, plan to hold the second impeachment vote at 5 p.m. on Saturday, December 14th. To pass the bill, they need at least 8 PPP members to secure the two-thirds majority required. Russia has launched a major missile and drone attack on Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky said Russia launched 93 missiles and nearly 200 drones in one of its largest wartime attacks on Ukraine's energy system. Zelensky said Ukrainian air defense managed to shoot down 81 Russian missiles, including 11 missiles that were downed by F-16 fighter jets. Ukraine's energy system has already suffered 11 waves of attacks this year. The Kremlin has praised U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's criticism of Ukrainian strikes using U.S. missiles deep within Russian territory. Trump criticized Ukraine's use of U.S.-supplied missiles for attacks deep into Russian territory in a Time magazine interview, comments that suggest he could alter the U.S. policy towards Ukraine at the same time. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov reminded reporters of the numerous sanctions and other hostile actions taken during Trump's first presidency. Russia's Defense Ministry has announced that its eastern grouping of forces has seized more than 300 square kilometers of territory in Ukraine over the past month. Additionally, the ministry reported that the forces had captured 7 settlements. Russian Defense Minister Andrei Bolosov also visited the eastern grouping and inspected the troops. White House spokesperson John Kirby has announced that the Biden administration is sending another package of weapons aid for Ukraine without disclosing the contents of the package. Kirby said that the U.S. would continue to provide additional aid to Ukraine right up to the end of this administration. Last month, President Joe Biden lifted the U.S. ban on Ukraine's use of U.S.-supplied long-range missiles for strikes deep inside Russia, marking his latest attempt to support Kiev in its battle with Russia. NATO head Mark Rutte has warned the US-led transatlantic alliance that it was not ready for the threats it would face from Russia. NATO Secretary General Rutte said NATO members had spent more than 3% of the GDP on defense during the Cold War, and future spending would have to be much higher than the current alliance target of 2%. Rutte added it is time to shift to a wartime mindset and turbocharge defense production and defense spending.
Producing huge numbers of tanks, armored vehicles and ammunition.
Well, that brings us to the end of our news bulletin. Here is what we've been covering. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes an unannounced visit to Iraq for talks on the future of Syria. Egypt and the League of Arab States condemn Israel's incursion into the buffer zone with Syria. And the death toll from Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip rises to over 44,000, with more than 106,000 wounded. This concludes our news bulletin for tonight. Don't forget to follow Qnews on YouTube, Facebook, X, Instagram, and TikTok at Qnews EGY to stay informed. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more updates on Qnews.